farmers have a margin problem. And one of the biggest issues creating that problem, input and fertilizer prices today.
My soil was basically dead. I tried everything, spent a fortune, nothing worked. Then I discovered one liquid that changed absolutely everything. And I cannot believe nobody talks about this. It costs nothing. You are probably throwing away the main ingredient every single week without even realizing it.
And from crop inputs to machinery, those prices really never came back down. So what's the root of the issue? And why are input prices, particularly fertilizer prices, so high? That's this weekend's Farm Journal report.
Gardening experts do not want you to know about this because once you do, you will never spend money on fertilizer again. Most people who have a garden and a few trees in their yard go through the same routine every autumn. The leaves come down, they pile up on the lawn, and at some point on a weekend, you get the rake out and spend a few hours gathering them all into one spot. It is satisfying work in a straightforward kind of way. You end up with a large mound of leaves, you feel like you have done something useful with them, and somewhere in the back of your mind you hold on to the idea that by the time spring comes around, that pile is going to have turned itself into something valuable. Free compost, essentially. Something you can dig into your beds and borders before the growing season gets going. That idea is not completely wrong. Leaves do break down over time. They do eventually become part of the soil. But there is a significant gap between what most people expect to happen and what actually happens when you pile leaves up and leave them to their own devices over winter. That gap is where a lot of frustration comes from. What you typically find in April when you go back to that pile with a shovel and some optimism is not rich, dark compost. What you find is a compressed mass of wet leaves. They are cold, they are heavy, and they have matted together into something that looks and feels a bit like wet cardboard that has been left out in the rain. There might be a slightly sour smell to it, something between mildew and stagnant water. The top layer will have dried out and gone grey, but pull that back and everything underneath is just sitting there, largely unchanged from when you piled it up in November. It has not decomposed in any meaningful way. It has just compressed and got wet. This is a genuinely common experience, and it leads a lot of people to conclude that they did something wrong, or that composting simply is not for them. They bag the whole thing up and put it out for the council to collect, and the following autumn, the same cycle starts over again. The good news is that this outcome is not the result of doing anything particularly wrong. It is the result of following the most commonly given advice about what to do with autumn leaves, which is also, as it turns out, the least effective method available. Understanding why it fails is the first step toward doing something that actually works. When you pile leaves up and leave them exposed to autumn and winter weather, a specific set of conditions develops inside that pile. Rain soaks into the leaves, and the weight of the material compresses everything downward. As that happens, the air gets pushed out. Oxygen levels inside the pile drop very quickly, and what you are left with is a cold, wet, airless environment. In biological terms, this is called an anaerobic environment, meaning one that lacks oxygen. This matters enormously because the organisms responsible for breaking down organic matter, the bacteria that drive decomposition, are aerobic. They require oxygen to function. Without it, their activity slows to almost nothing and the pile essentially stalls. The leaves do not rot in any meaningful sense. They just sit there in a state that some researchers have described as a kind of suspended animation. The material is preserved rather than broken down. This is the core reason why the passive pile method produces such disappointing results. It is not a composting system in any active sense. It is closer to a storage system, and not a particularly good one at that. There is also a second factor at work, and this one is less obvious. Autumn leaves are composed almost entirely of carbon. When a tree prepares for winter, it draws the nutrients, the sugars and proteins, back into its trunk and root system. What falls to the ground is effectively the empty shell, the packaging. In terms of its chemical composition, a dried autumn leaf is roughly 80 parts carbon to 1 part nitrogen. That ratio is important because it is far outside the range that soil bacteria can work with efficiently. Research into composting biology, including work published by institutions such as Cornell University's composting program, has consistently identified the carbon to nitrogen ratio as one of the most critical factors in determining how quickly organic material breaks down. The optimal range for active decomposition sits at around 25 to 30 parts carbon to 1 part nitrogen. At that ratio, bacteria have access to both the energy they need from carbon and the protein they need from nitrogen to build their own cells and reproduce out. When the ratio is as high, as 80:1 as it is with a pile of pure leaves, the bacteria run out of nitrogen almost immediately. They consume a small amount of material, hit a wall, and their population collapses. The pile goes cold, activity stops, and nothing much happens. A common response to a stalled pile is to turn it more often, to mix the material up and try to get things moving again mechanically. It is an understandable instinct, but it does not address the actual problem. Mixing a pile that is short on nitrogen does not create nitrogen. It just moves the same material around. The biological reaction cannot proceed because the chemistry is not right, regardless of how many times the pile is turned. This combination of factors, the anaerobic conditions created by compression and rain and the severe nitrogen deficiency of the leaves themselves, is what causes the vast majority of backyard leaf piles to fail. The leaves are not the problem, they are actually a significant resource. A large autumn leaf pile represents a substantial amount of carbon, which is the primary building block of compost and ultimately of healthy soil. The issue is simply that leaves on their own, piled up and left out, do not have what they need to convert that carbon into anything useful within a reasonable time frame. Left completely alone, a pile of leaves will eventually break down. Studies and practical observations from long-term composting trials suggest that under purely passive conditions, whole leaves can take anywhere from 2 to 5 years to fully decompose, depending on the species, the climate, and the conditions of a given site. That is a long time to wait for something you need to use in your garden next spring. The encouraging part of all this is that the problems are well understood and the solutions are straightforward. Once you understand what is actually happening inside a leaf pile and why it stalls, the path to fixing it becomes clear. It does not require expensive equipment or specialist knowledge. It requires adjusting two things: the physical structure of the leaves themselves and the chemistry of the pile. Both of those things are entirely within reach for anyone with a garden, a lawnmower, and access to a few basic materials. The passive pile approach persists because it feels intuitive. Nature breaks things down, leaves fall in the forest, and eventually become soil. Leaving a pile alone seems like it should work the same way, but a garden is not a forest, and the conditions are not the same. A forest floor is a complex layered system with a constant supply of varied organic material, established fungal networks, and organisms that have been building up in the soil for decades or longer. A pile of leaves raked into a corner of a suburban garden does not have those advantages. It is a simplified system that needs a little help to function within a useful time frame. The following sections of this guide cover exactly what that help looks like and how to chercher. Apply it in a way that can turn a season's worth of fallen leaves into finished compost in a matter of weeks rather than years. Now that the problem is clear, the question becomes what to do about it. The two issues identified in the previous section, the lack of oxygen and the nitrogen deficiency, are both fixable. Neither requires a significant investment of money or time, but both require a deliberate approach. This is not about working harder, it's about working with biology rather than against it. The starting point is the carbon to nitrogen ratio because that is the more fundamental of the two problems. A pile of pure autumn leaves sits at roughly 80 parts carbon to 1 part nitrogen. The target for active decomposition is somewhere between 25 and 30 to 1. That gap needs to be closed, and the way to close it is by introducing a nitrogen source into the pile. This is not a new idea. Composting guides and agricultural extension services have been making this recommendation for decades. The question is not whether to add nitrogen, but how to add it effectively, because the method matters as much as the material. The most common mistake at this stage is adding a dry nitrogen source and assuming it will do the job. Blood meal, pelleted chicken manure, and similar products are all genuinely high in nitrogen and are widely available from garden centres. They work, but only if they actually come into contact with the leaves. If you sprinkle a dry powder over a pile of loose leaves, the particles sift downward through the gaps in the material by gravity and settle at the bottom. The leaves in the middle and top of the pile remain untouched. The nitrogen and the carbon are in the same general area, but they are not in contact with each other, and a biological reaction requires contact. Chemistry cannot happen at a distance. The solution to this is to dissolve the nitrogen source in water and apply it as a liquid. This approach solves two problems simultaneously. It delivers nitrogen directly to the surface of the leaf material, coating each piece rather than pooling at the bottom, and it introduces moisture, which is the other essential ingredient for microbial activity. Bacteria require water to function. A dry pile is a dormant pile, regardless of how well balanced the carbon to nitrogen ratio might be. The preparation of a nitrogen solution is straightforward. If you keep chickens or rabbits, fresh manure from either animal is an excellent nitrogen source and has the added benefit of containing live gut bacteria that can act as a starter culture for the composting process. 2 shovels of fresh manure mixed into a standard 5-gallon bucket of water, stirred until it resembles dark, muddy liquid, produces a highly effective accelerator. The nitrogen content of chicken manure in particular is well documented. Research published through various agricultural institutions has noted that fresh chicken manure contains between 2 and 5% nitrogen by weight, which makes it one of the more potent organic nitrogen sources available to home gardeners. If you do not keep livestock, blood meal is the most practical alternative and is available at most garden centres without any difficulty. It is a byproduct of meat processing and is one of the highest nitrogen organic amendments commercially available, typically containing around 12 to 13% nitrogen by weight. 2 cups dissolved into a 5-gallon bucket of water produces a liquid with sufficient nitrogen concentration to treat a substantial pile of shredded leaves. Pelleted chicken manure fertilizer, which is also widely available and less pungent to work with than fresh manure, is another viable option and can be used in similar quantities. The goal in each case is the same: to create a liquid that can be poured evenly over the leaf material so that the nitrogen reaches every part of the pile rather than just the bottom layer. Before that liquid is applied, however, there are 2 preparatory steps that will determine whether the pile succeeds or fails, and both of them need to happen before any mixing or layering takes place. The first is the choice of location. This might seem like a minor consideration, but it has a real effect on the outcome. The pile needs to be built directly on bare earth, either soil or grass, rather than on concrete, paving, or any other hard surface. The reason for this is that soil contains an enormous population of organisms, including bacteria, fungi, beetles, worms, and many others, that will naturally migrate into the base of the pile as conditions become favorable. These organisms contribute to the decomposition process and help to process material that the thermophilic bacteria at the core of the pile have already partially broken down. When a pile is built on concrete, that connection is severed. The pile becomes an isolated system and it loses access to a significant biological resource that costs nothing and requires no effort to engage. A patch of ground roughly 4 feet by 4 feet is sufficient for a productive pile of the size that will be covered in the next section. The second preparatory step is the one that makes the single biggest practical difference to the speed and effectiveness of the composting process. And it is also the one most often skipped because it requires a small amount of additional effort up front. The leaves must be shredded before they go into the pile. A whole autumn leaf has a specific physical structure that actively resists decomposition. The outer surface of a leaf has a waxy coating, the cuticle, which the tree produces to regulate water loss and protect the leaf during its functional life. This coating is hydrophobic, meaning it repels water. When leaves are stacked whole on top of each other, they behave rather like roof tiles or fish scales, with each leaf shedding water onto the one below and directing it away from the interior of the pile. Pour water or a nitrogen solution onto a pile of whole, intact leaves and most of it will run off the sides. The interior stays dry, the carbon stays locked. Shredding the leaves destroys that architecture completely. Running a lawnmower over the collected leaves, either on the lawn before raking or through a bagger attachment, tears the waxy surface apart and reduces the leaves to small, irregular fragments. This has 2 significant effects. First, it eliminates the waterproofing. The broken edges and torn surfaces absorb liquid rather than repelling it, which means the nitrogen solution can penetrate the material and reach the bacteria rather than running off. Second, it increases the surface area of the material enormously. This matters because decomposition is a surface phenomenon. Bacteria colonize the outer surface of organic particles and work inward. A whole leaf has a relatively small surface area relative to its volume. Shred that same leaf into dozens of small pieces and the Total surface area available for bacterial colonization increases by a factor that researchers working in composting science have estimated at several 100%, depending on the degree of fragmentation. The practical difference this makes to decomposition speed is not subtle. Studies comparing the breakdown rates of whole leaves versus shredded leaves under otherwise identical conditions have found that shredded material can decompose in a fraction of the time. Some practical composting guides cite a difference of a full year or more, with whole leaves taking 12 months or longer to break down passively, while shredded leaves treated correctly can produce finished compost in as little as 3 to 4 weeks under active management. The mowing step takes perhaps 15 to 20 minutes for a typical suburban garden's worth of leaves. The return on that time investment is considerable. Once the leaves are shredded and the nitrogen solution is prepared, and once a suitable patch of bare ground has been identified, the physical conditions needed to run an effective composting process are in place. The carbon is present in the shredded leaf material. The nitrogen is dissolved and ready to be applied. The location provides access to the soil biology that will support the process from below. What remains is the assembly, the specific way in which these components are combined to create the conditions in which aerobic decomposition can proceed rapidly and consistently. The temptation at this point is to simply mix everything together in one go and hope for the best. That approach will produce better results than an untreated pile of whole leaves, but it will not produce the best results available. The way the materials are layered and moistened during construction determines how evenly the nitrogen is distributed through the pile, how well the moisture is balanced throughout, and ultimately how hot and how consistently the pile will run during the active phase. Getting that construction step right is what separates a pile that heats to the temperatures needed to kill weed seeds and pathogens from one that barely warms up and takes months to produce anything usable. The construction process and the management of the active decomposition cycle are covered in the next section. With the leaves shredded, the nitrogen solution prepared, and a suitable patch of ground identified, everything needed to run an effective composting process is ready. What happens at this stage determines whether the pile becomes a working biological system or just another heap of organic material sitting in a corner of the garden. The assembly is not complicated, but the details matter, and taking a few extra minutes to get them right during construction will have a significant impact on the results. The most effective way to build the pile is in layers, alternating the shredded leaf material with applications of the nitrogen solution rather than mixing everything together at once. Start by spreading a base layer of shredded leaves directly onto the patch of bare ground. Aim for a depth of around 6 inches. The material should look light and loose at this stage, not compacted. Once the base layer is down, take a watering can or a smaller container and apply the nitrogen solution over the surface, moving back and forth to get even coverage across the whole layer rather than concentrating it in one area. The step that follows is important and is often left out of basic composting instructions. After applying the liquid, reach into the layer and turn the material by hand, lifting and mixing it so that the moisture and nitrogen are distributed as evenly as possible through the depth of that layer rather than sitting on the surface. Look for dry pockets and add a little more liquid where needed. What you are aiming for is a consistent moisture level throughout, and the way to check that is with what is sometimes called the squeeze test. Take a handful of the material and compress it firmly in your fist. When you open your hand, the mixture should hold together loosely, roughly in the shape it was squeezed into, and only 1 or 2 drops of water should appear at your knuckles. If water runs freely from the material when squeezed, it is too wet and more dry leaf material needs to be incorporated. If the mixture crumbles and falls apart immediately, it is too dry and more liquid is needed. This moisture level, often described in composting literature as equivalent to a wrung-out sponge, is the balance at which aerobic bacteria are most active. Too wet and the pile becomes waterlogged and anaerobic. Too dry and bacterial activity slows or stops entirely. Once the first layer passes the squeeze test, add another 6 inches of shredded leaves on top and repeat the process. Apply the nitrogen solution, mix the layer by hand, check the moisture. Continue in this way until all the leaf material has been used. The finished pile should be at least 3 feet tall and 3 feet wide. This size is not arbitrary. Research into thermophilic composting, the type that generates significant heat, consistently identifies minimum pile volume as a critical factor. A pile smaller than roughly 1 cubic meter does not have enough mass to retain the heat generated by microbial activity at its core. The heat dissipates into the surrounding air faster than it can build up, and the pile never reaches the temperatures needed for rapid decomposition. A pile of 3 feet by 3 feet has sufficient volume to insulate its own core and create the thermal conditions required for the process to work efficiently. When construction is complete, the pile should look noticeably different from a standard leaf heap. It should stand up on its own with some structure, feel damp to the touch, and have a loose, open texture rather than a dense, compacted one. Covering it loosely with an old piece of carpet or a tarp helps to retain moisture and trap heat without sealing the pile off from air circulation. Airflow is essential, and the covering should never be sealed tightly around the base. For the first 3 days after building the pile, leave it completely undisturbed. Inside the pile during this period, the aerobic bacteria present in the leaf material, the soil and the nitrogen solution are beginning to consume the available sugars and proteins. As they feed and multiply, they generate heat as a byproduct of their metabolic activity. This is the same basic process that causes a compost pile to warm up, and it is well documented in the scientific literature on composting biology. Under optimal conditions, the internal temperature of an actively managed pile can rise to between 55 and 70 degrees Celsius, which is roughly 130 to 160 degrees Fahrenheit, within the first few days. At these temperatures, the thermophilic bacteria, those adapted to function in high heat environments, become the dominant population and drive the bulk of the decomposition. On the morning of the 3rd or 4th day, check the pile by inserting your hand or a compost thermometer into the center. If the pile has been built correctly, the interior should feel noticeably hot, significantly warmer than the surrounding air, and steam may be visible rising from the material in cool morning conditions. This is the confirmation that the biological process is running. If the pile feels only slightly warm or shows no heat at all at this stage, it is worth checking the moisture level and considering whether additional nitrogen solution needs to be worked in. By around the 5th day, the temperature in the core of the pile will typically begin to drop. This is not a sign that the process has finished. It is a sign that the bacteria in the center have consumed most of the available oxygen and that the pile needs to be turned. Turning the pile at this point, using a garden fork or pitchfork to move the outer material into the center and the central material to the outside, does 2 things. It reintroduces oxygen throughout the pile, which allows the aerobic bacteria to continue functioning, and it moves material that has been sitting in the cooler, drier outer zone into the hot core where active decomposition is taking place. As the pile is turned, check the moisture level again using the squeeze test and add water from a hose if the material has dried out. The heat generated by microbial activity drives off moisture continuously, and maintaining the right moisture level throughout the process requires periodic adjustment. After turning, the temperature will typically spike again within 24 hours as the fresh oxygen fuels a new round of intense microbial activity. This cycle of heating, turning, and reheating is the engine of hot composting, and is what makes it possible to compress a decomposition timeline that would naturally take years into a period of a few weeks. Turning the pile every 2 days, or so during the active phase, is the general recommendation from most composting researchers and practitioners, though the precise interval is less important than responding to the temperature signals the pile gives. When the temperature drops, it is time to turn. Between days 10 and 12, the character of the material begins to change noticeably. The shredded leaf fragments lose their individual identity and begin to merge into a darker, more uniform mass. The smell shifts as well. The sharp, slightly ammonia-like scent of the active nitrogen-rich phase gives way to something earthier and more neutral, closer to the smell of soil after rain or the floor of a woodland. This change in smell is a reliable indicator of progress and reflects the shift in microbial populations as the easily available energy sources are consumed and the more complex organic compounds begin to break down. By day 18 to 20, the pile will stop reheating regardless of how frequently it is turned. Thermophilic phase has run its course. The easily available carbon and nitrogen have been processed, the heat-loving bacteria have completed their work, and the pile enters a curing phase in which fungi, worms, and other organisms move in to finish the breakdown of the remaining complex materials. This cooling and curing period is a normal and necessary part of the process, not a failure. Finished compost that has not been allowed to cure fully can actually have a mildly negative effect on plant growth due to residual microbial activity competing with plant roots for nitrogen, a phenomenon that composting researchers refer to as nitrogen drawdown. Allowing the pile to cool and stabilize for a further week or two after the thermophilic phase ends addresses this. What remains after the full cycle is a material that looks and feels entirely different from the leaves it came from. It is dark brown to black, crumbles easily between the fingers, and has a consistent earthy smell. It retains moisture without becoming waterlogged. This is finished compost, and its value to garden soil is well established. Beyond simply adding organic matter, mature compost introduces a diverse population of beneficial microorganisms into the soil, improves soil structure and water retention, and releases nutrients gradually in forms that plant roots can access. Research from a range of agricultural and horticultural institutions has consistently shown that regular compost application improves both soil health and plant productivity over time, particularly in soils that have been depleted by intensive planting or that are naturally low in organic matter. From a practical standpoint, a single productive composting cycle using one season's worth of leaves from an average-sized garden can produce several wheelbarrow loads of finished compost. At current garden centre prices for bagged compost or soil improver, that represents a meaningful saving, and unlike a bag of commercial compost, the material produced from your own leaves contains no additives, fillers, or unknown inputs. You know exactly what went into it. The process described across this guide is not experimental. It is based on the same principles that have been studied and documented in composting science for decades, applied in a practical, accessible way that works in a standard domestic garden. The autumn leaf fall that most people treat as a seasonal problem to be cleared away and forgotten is approached differently, one of the more useful free resources available to any gardener. Biology does the work. What is required from the gardener is the initial understanding of what the biology needs and the willingness to provide it.